will rally round the flag, boys will rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Written in 1861, the battle cry of freedom, performed here by Dennis Kennedy, served as a powerful recruitment tool in the aftermath of the Union Army's defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run. In our previous podcasts, we described military operations in the border states during this period, citing President Lincoln's acerbic line, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Indeed, having declared itself neutral at the outset of the war, Kentucky became a key objective for both North and South in the first year of the fighting. The state's legislature eventually settled the issue by voting to expel a force of Confederate invaders, yet it remained for Union forces to secure the blessings of what was a purely political decision. This task eventually fell to a former West Pointer who had resigned from the Army in 1854 only to prove a failure in civilian life. Hard-bitten yet determined, Ulysses S. Grant would win national recognition for his successful conquest of Forts Henry and Donelson in western Kentucky, and go on to launch an ambitious campaign deep within Confederate Tennessee. We continue now with our reading of Fateful Lightning by William Hillenbrand, and a chapter titled A Crack in the Western Wall. Early in its existence, the Confederate States of America made a perfectly reasonable and profoundly fateful decision. When Virginia left the Union after Fort Sumter, the Confederacy shifted its capital from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia. One consequence of this move was that it compelled the Richmond government to commit a fuller measure of its limited resources to the Eastern Theater, leaving the vital West vulnerable to federal invasion. The task of defending the West fell to one of Jefferson Davis's favorites, Major General Albert Sidney Johnston, handsome and personable, and thought by many to be the South's ablest soldier. Johnston's Department of Missouri covered a 500-mile front reaching from the eastern border of Kentucky to Missouri's southwest corner. His 70,000 troops, poorly armed and equipped, confronted 150,000 Federals. Against these long odds he had, however, one advantage: a divided Federal command structure. West of the Cumberland River, Henry Halleck commanded the Department of the Missouri. East of it, Don Carlos Buell commanded the Department of the Ohio. Halleck had a reputation as the old Army's intellectual, but Old Brains, as he was sometimes called, was an administrator, not a fighting field commander. Buell likewise was an able administrator, but slow, cautious, and tentative in the field. Neither was eager to act decisively nor to cooperate with one another effectively. Yet once the Federal campaign for the control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers actually got underway, active leadership would fall on two aggressive commanders. One, a Connecticut-born freshwater sailor, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote. The other, that determined little brigadier from Illinois, Ulysses S. Grant. At the beginning of 1862, the line of the Mississippi was effectively closed to Federal operations, chiefly due to the engineering of Confederate General Leonidas Polk. Upon seizing Columbus, Kentucky, back in September of '61, Polk had set to work fortifying that place, and by February of '62 the presence of 140 heavy guns on high bluffs commanding the river went a long way to make it, as Southerners proudly put it, the Gibraltar of the West. Confederate defenses on the Tennessee and Cumberland, however, were much less formidable. If the Federals could gain control of Fort Henry on the Tennessee, northern Mississippi and Alabama were open to invasion. If they could clear Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, the river road to Nashville, Tennessee would be open. With 15,000 men at Cairo, Illinois, which controlled the mouths of both rivers, Ulysses Grant was in the right place at the right time to make such an effort. Events would prove that he was also the right man in the right place. The first blow of the campaign for control of the western rivers came at the eastern extremity of Johnston's line, where a small Confederate force under Major General George Crittenden crossed the Cumberland and headed north to threaten central Kentucky. Marching to confront this threat was Brigadier General George Thomas, a Virginia-born Union man who would earn a lasting name as a redoubtable fighter. The collision occurred near the village of Mill Springs, where Crittenden's force was soundly beaten. In one blow, the right of Johnston's long line was gone. The effort on Johnston's left began when Halleck, after months of indecision, ordered Grant to seize Fort Henry on the Tennessee. Grant's plan was simple. He would move his 15,000 men by transport and invest Fort Henry by land. At the same time, Flag Officer Foote would steam upriver with his flotilla of gunboats and attack the fort from the river. These gunboats were shallow-draft paddle-wheelers, protected by a sharply angled iron casemate. They looked to some like turtles, and were thus known as Pooke's turtles, after Samuel Pooke, the designer of the casemate. As playful as the name sounded, however, there was nothing playful about their purpose, for each carried 13 heavy guns. Indeed, the capture of Fort Henry would be one of the easiest victories of the war. Although commanded by a tough-minded Kentucky brigadier, Lloyd Tillman, Fort Henry was a difficult place to defend under the best of circumstances. Built on a low bank of the Tennessee River, surrounded by high hills, it was subject to flooding whenever the river rose, and as it happened, 6 of its guns were under water at the time of the attack. Those that remained high and dry were ancient and inadequate, and to make matters worse, the garrison itself was small and poorly armed. In any case, on February 5, 1862, Grant got his men in transports, and under the protection of 4 of Foote's turtles, landed them a few miles below the fort. While Grant attacked from the rear, Foote was to attack from the river. Before the infantry could reach the fort along rain-soaked roads, however, the Navy opened the fight. Tillman saw immediately the hopelessness of his position. Foote could bring 54 guns to bear on the fort, while he, Tillman, could answer with only 9. He therefore sent his garrison on a 12-mile trek cross-country to Fort Donelson, and with a rear-guard artillery company put up a gallant little fight. 2 hours later, well before the first of Grant's infantry could reach the place, Tillman surrendered. At this point, Foote sent 3 gunboats steaming up the Tennessee as far as Muscle Shoals, Alabama, wrecking Confederate ships and sowing panic in the heartland as he went. Grant, meanwhile, telegraphed Halleck news of the victory. "Fort Henry is ours," he wrote. "I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th." Johnston, and indeed the whole Confederate high command, was beginning to see with terrible clarity the unsettling dimensions of their predicament. George Thomas had knocked Johnston's right loose at Mill Springs. Now Grant had punched a hole in his center. Buell's Federals were still in Middle Kentucky, square across the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and threatening the latter place. In response, Jefferson Davis sent Beauregard to confer with Johnston about a strategic plan to shore up the collapsing Confederate line. Beauregard, whose aggressive action at First Bull Run had won him a handsome victory, urged swift and decisive blows. Hit Grant hard, then turn on Buell. To Johnston, the plan seemed long odds. Rather than striking each Federal army separately, Johnston might, if the Yankees concentrated fast enough, be struck himself on both flanks simultaneously. Johnston first argued for withdrawal to the southwest, saving his army and looking for an opportunity to fight on more favorable terms. The rub here was that retreat meant abandoning Nashville, whose vital industry and railroads the South could not afford to lose. Stuck between two perilous alternatives, Johnston settled on a curious and controversial half-measure. He decided to reinforce Donelson with 12,000 men in hopes that they could hold off Grant. But Johnston's choice for the command of Donelson did not bode well. It was John Floyd, infamous with Northerners who believed that he had shipped arms south as President Buchanan's Secretary of War. With Southerners he was hardly more popular for his inept performance in the mountains of western Virginia. Nevertheless, having made his choice, Johnston withdrew to Nashville with the rest of his army. As the roads dried and the weather warmed, Grant moved his men eastward cross-country, following the route of Fort Henry's luckless garrison. Their easy victory and the pleasure of marching roads that had a bottom to them put them in a buoyant mood. Many tossed greatcoats and blankets aside, acts they would have full cause to regret on miserable nights soon to come. Grant had wired Halleck of his intent to take and destroy Donelson on February 8th, but between the rain and the delays in getting his column organized, he was not in front of Donelson until the 12th. Fort Donelson itself was no Gibraltar, but neither was it Fort Henry. On the Cumberland River side, a dozen guns stood ready to contest Foote's gunboats. On the land side ran 3 semicircular lines of trench. Manning them was a garrison that had swelled to 16,000 with the recent arrival of Johnston's reinforcements, a force slightly larger than Grant's own at this point. Still, it was the Confederate garrison and not Grant's army that was in mortal danger. Grant, reiterating his Fort Henry plan, determined to invest Donelson on the land side with infantry and pound it from the river with Foote's ironclads. After receiving 10,000 reinforcements, Grant on the 14th ordered Foote to steam upriver and commence firing while his infantry and artillery pressed the Confederate trenches. Foote was himself something of an anomaly, a sailor who abhorred both rum and profanity. But as a highly capable seaman, he had some doubts that his ironclads were entirely the invincible technological terrors the rebels feared they were. Closing to within a mile of the fort on the afternoon of the 14th, his 4 ironclad and 2 wooden gunboats opened up from a point out of range of the lighter rebel guns. He might have wisely remained at that range, too, but reiterating his own tactics at Henry, he pressed his attack to within 400 yards of Donelson's water batteries. At this distance his guns were overshooting their mark, but the Confederates were driving their shots home with a will. In the end, Foote's flotilla was driven back downstream badly hurt. Foote's own flagship, the St. Louis, was struck 59 times and went rudderless downstream, Foote himself slightly wounded. Although he had more than 50 seamen dead, he had not silenced a single gun nor killed a single gunner. The waterborne Achilles had, at least momentarily, discovered his vulnerable heel. This respite from destruction, however, did not mean that the Confederate situation was anything less than critical. Sooner or later, remaining in Donelson would mean destruction or surrender. Inside the fort, Floyd convened a council of war with Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, his second-in-command, and Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner. Although Pillow had fought in Mexico, neither officers nor men had much confidence in him. In fact, when all was said and done, the one distinction in Pillow's war record was that he was the only officer on either side whom Grant spoke contemptuously of in his memoirs. Buckner had led home guards back in the days of Kentucky's tenuous neutrality. Of the 3 defending commanders, he was the ablest soldier, but he was third in command. In any case, the council agreed that the garrison would try to break its way out in the morning. Massing their forces on the left, Pillow's front, they would punch a hole in the Union right at break of day, open a corridor of escape, and double-quick down the Nashville road. If things looked desperate in the rebel camps on the night of February 14th, there was a good measure of misery in the Yankee camps, too. The weather took a nasty turn, and scouring sleet and snow made many a shivering trooper regret a coat or a blanket left on the road from Fort Henry. The Union right was held by a division commanded by John McClernand. On the bright winter dawn of the 15th, Pillow's infantry, with Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry on his flank, drove into McClernand's division. The fighting was sharp all along a front 5 brigades wide, but after 3 hours the rebels had made the full weight of their attack felt. McClernand's men, now exhausted and out of ammunition, had been driven more than a mile. Further, their withdrawal had exposed the flank of a division in the center belonging to Lew Wallace. By noon the corridor that Pillow had planned was achieved. The road to Nashville was open, and Buckner's troops were on hand to hold it open while the column marched through and away. Pillow wired to Johnston a curious telegram. "On the honor of a soldier, the day is ours." If the expression "the day is ours" means we have won a decisive victory, then nothing of the kind had taken place. But what Pillow had achieved was no mean feat. The opportunity was at hand to save his army from destruction. What Pillow did next was even more curious. He chose not to seize the opportunity his men had fought so fiercely to gain, ordering his divisions back into their trenches. From this distance it is hard to imagine what Pillow was thinking. Perhaps he thought he could hold the place after all. Perhaps he thought his troops were too fought out to make a hard march, and would be caught in flank by a Yankee counterattack. In any event, Floyd arrived on the scene, and, over Buckner's vehement protests, confirmed Pillow's order. Fort Donelson was finished. Grant, a quiet man with a combative nature, arrived on the Union right and quickly appraised the situation. As Lew Wallace remembered it, Grant said, "Some of our men are pretty badly demoralized, but the enemy must be more so, for he has attempted to break out but has fallen back. The one who attacks first now will be victorious." Grant ordered a counterattack, regained what the morning's fighting had lost, and with Foote shelling the fort from the river and Smith's men pressing hard in front, the Federals once more closed the ring. What happened next was not the Confederacy's finest hour. Floyd, seeing the inevitability of Donelson's surrender, wanted no part of it. First, there was that little matter of looting Federal arsenals in Buchanan's administration. Graver yet, what Southerners were calling the Revolution of 1860, many hard-shell Unionists were calling treason, a hanging offense. Floyd handed the command over to Pillow, boarded a steamer, and fled upstream. Pillow, in turn, handed the command to Buckner, and soon after followed Floyd to safety. There was in this shabby proceeding one bright moment for the rebels that many Yankees would have cause to regret. The cavalryman Bedford Forrest, a self-made man and self-taught military genius, was absolutely outraged. He hadn't brought his command to Donelson to surrender it, he told Buckner. He would take his people out or bust hell wide open. In the icy darkness, he took his troopers through Grant's lines. Later, William Tecumseh Sherman would pay him a high compliment, calling him simply, "that devil, Forrest." All of this, of course, left Buckner holding the bag. He wrote to Grant, asking for surrender terms and hoping for the best. He and Grant had after all been friendly, if not friends, in the old army, and once, when Grant was down on his luck, Buckner had reached into his pocket to hand him a small loan. Reading Grant's reply, Buckner understandably found it ungenerous and unchivalrous, and in truth it was. To Buckner, Grant wrote, "No terms except an immediate and unconditional surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately on your works." Perhaps chivalry, too, was becoming a casualty of war. In any case, by February 16, 1862, Grant's army had hammered a crack in the Confederacy's western wall. As for U.S. Grant, Northern papers would begin to write that U.S. stood for unconditional surrender. The Confederate defeat at Forts Henry and Donelson made Albert Sidney Johnston the center of a firestorm of criticism, as Southerners despondently weighed the strategic consequences of their loss. The Federals were in control on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and more than 12,000 Confederates were their prisoners of war. Nashville itself, capital of Tennessee, was now indefensible and would have to be evacuated. Threatened from the west by John Pope's Army of the Mississippi, Columbus, Kentucky, the Gibraltar of the West, likewise had to be abandoned, allowing Pope to move downriver to operate against the next important rebel position on the Mississippi, Island No. 10. The first week of March brought Southerners more bitter news. A small Confederate army under Earl Van Dorn, with a design to march on St. Louis, struck a Federal force under Samuel R. Curtis along the Arkansas-Missouri border. In a pitched battle south of Pea Ridge, Van Dorn was driven from the field and his army scattered. In just a month, the Confederacy had been defeated all along its western line, its right at Mill Springs, its center at Henry and Donelson, and now its left at Pea Ridge. The Northern press began writing confidently that the end of the rebellion was at hand. Even unbending Jefferson Davis, who would be still writing proclamations about ultimate victory after his capital had fallen, had to admit that the tide is for the moment against us. Albert Sidney Johnston, though defeated in the field and vilified in the press, had not lost confidence in his cause or in himself. That was one crucial point in his favor. A second was the fact that the Richmond government, seeing the gravity of the situation, acted vigorously to reinforce him. By the first part of April, Johnston had gathered more than 40,000 men in and around Corinth, Mississippi. Of course, it was also true that his army was indifferently armed and equipped and almost absolutely raw, both officers and men. The next big fight would be the first for 8 out of 10 of Johnston's soldiers, as well as the last for many. Still, if Johnston could strike Grant, now moving slowly up the Tennessee, before Buell joined him, he could fight on roughly equal terms. A third point in Johnston's favor was, ironically, one consequence of the conquest of Henry and Donelson. Although Henry Halleck had done little in the campaign except sit in his St. Louis office and rub his elbows, an odd nervous tic, the victories and his own politicking had given him top command in the West. Old Brains was nothing if not cautious, and Buell was no driver. Johnston believed that he could bring Grant to battle before Buell arrived. By the first week of April, Grant was in camp at Pittsburgh Landing on the west bank of the Tennessee, just a brisk march from the Mississippi border. He had spent most of the previous month drilling his troops, waiting for Buell's Army of the Ohio, making its laborious way down from Nashville, and planning a drive into Mississippi. That plan says much about Grant's genius as a field commander. His first instinct was always to focus on what he was going to do to the enemy, never on what the enemy might do to him. It was a combative instinct that would make him supremely successful, but in April of 1862, with his back against the bluffs of the Tennessee River, it would leave him supremely vulnerable. 5 of Grant's divisions were camped on a broad, high plateau just west of the landing between 2 creeks, Snake Creek to the north and Lick Creek a couple of miles to the south. A 6th was just north of Snake Creek, protecting Crump's Landing downriver. Although Grant was well aware that Johnston was posted in force in Corinth, just 20-odd miles away, he gave little thought to defense. First, he supposed that Johnston, already beaten in spirit and leading a demoralized army, would never attack. To Halleck he wired that he had scarcely the faintest idea of an attack being made upon us. To his staff he said frankly that he expected Corinth to fall more easily than Donelson. One of his brigadiers, Charles F. Smith, went so far as to say that he wanted nothing better than to have the rebels come out and attack us. We can whip them to hell. Second, thinking offensively, Grant wanted his army to think offensively too. To entrench on a defensive line, Grant believed, would thwart the aggressive spirit of his army. It was a motion seconded by General Smith. If we begin to spade, the men will think we fear the enemy." In the end, Grant's divisions lay in their camps with only casual patrols and a loose line of pickets to discover what might be just west of a little log meeting house called Shiloh Church. While Grant was making up his mind that Johnston was already whipped, Johnston was taking a page from Grant's book. That is, thinking hard about what he would do to Grant, and not what Grant, soon to be reinforced, might then do to him. Although his army was but half-trained and almost thoroughly untried, he intended to march it northeast to Pittsburgh Landing, pitch into the Yankees camped there, and drive them into the river. If he succeeded, the Confederacy would regain Tennessee and Kentucky. In a month he might be operating on the Ohio River. Near midnight on April 2nd, 1862, Beauregard, Johnston's second in command, received a wire from Bethel, 20 miles to the north. It reported elements of Lew Wallace's division operating in that area. Believing this activity to mean the beginning of a Federal drive on Memphis, Beauregard sent the wire on to Johnston with this notation: "Now is the moment to advance and strike the enemy at Pittsburgh Landing." Although Johnston would have liked to wait for Van Dorn's 10,000 reinforcements on their way from Arkansas, each day's delay meant that Buell's 25,000 were a day's march nearer to Grant. In the early hours of April 3rd, Johnston ordered his 4 corps commanders to be ready to advance upon the enemy in the morning by 6 a.m., with 3 days' cooked rations in haversacks, 100 rounds of ammunition for small arms, and 200 rounds for field pieces. To Beauregard fell the responsibility for drafting the Army's marching orders. On the map his plan was complicated but sound enough. 2 roads led northeast out of Corinth. 2 corps, William Hardee's in the lead and Bishop Polk's behind, would take the upper road. The other 2 corps, Braxton Bragg's in the lead and John C. Breckinridge's behind, would take the lower. When they reached striking distance, they would converge and form for battle along the entire Federal front, Hardee in the first line, Bragg 500 yards to his rear, and Polk and Breckinridge in reserve. Attacking to the northeast, they would fall heaviest on the Federal left, pry the Yankees loose from the landing, then drive them into the swampy ground around Owl Creek to the north, where they would be overwhelmed. But when the Army finally got on the road on April 3rd, already 4 hours late, Johnston began to discover that Bragg had not been far wrong when he complained, "This command was not an army at all, but this mob we have." In fact, the march to Pittsburgh Landing became a spectacle of confusion reminiscent of the armed mob that luckless McDowell had led down to Manassas. Gaps in the line of march opened, and then units had to double quick to close them up. No sooner was a gap closed when the whole column would come to a dead halt while an exasperating jam ahead was cleared. Units took wrong turns and were lost. A torrential rain turned the roads into a miserable gumbo. Johnston's army, which had been organized into corps only a week before, was unraveling on the road. In the end, the army that was supposed to have made its assault at dawn of April 4th was not in position opposite Pittsburgh Landing until nearly dusk on April 5th. In council of war late that afternoon, Johnston met with Beauregard and his corps commanders. Urging Johnston to cancel the attack, Beauregard argued 3 points chiefly. 1. That their 2-day delay must mean that Buell had reached Grant. 2. That success depended on surprise, and all chance of surprise had been lost on the muddy roads from Corinth. And 3. If and when they finally struck, they would find the enemy entrenched to the eyes and immovable. His points were perfectly reasonable, but, as it turned out, wrong. And ultimately all were beside the point, because Albert Sidney Johnston had already made up his mind to fight at Pittsburgh Landing. Perhaps he was thinking of his tarnished reputation. Perhaps he was thinking of the effusive address that had lately been read to his troops, in which he vowed that "your generals will lead you confidently to the combat." Buell or no Buell, Johnston insisted, I would fight them if they were 1,000,000. Gentlemen, we shall attack at daylight tomorrow. One thing is clear. There is no reason that the Yankees should not have been prepared and entrenched to the eyes. The rebels, as they approached the field, observed no particular silence or secrecy. When a popular officer rode by, they lifted a cheer for him. Many green soldiers, wondering if their cartridges would fire after the soaking rain, put them to the test by firing odd shots, all of this within earshot of the Yankee pickets. Sherman's division, westernmost from the landing, lost a picket detail to Confederate cavalry, and a company sent forward to press them was driven in, palpable evidence of Confederate presence. Sherman even had perfectly sound intelligence that he might have considered prudently. On April 5th, an Ohio colonel reported rebels active and in strength just west of his regiment. In fact, he made the same report rather nervously several times that day. Sherman, who had himself taken a leave of absence from the war for a case of nerves, concluded that this was a case of the colonel who cried wolf. "Take your damn regiment back to Ohio," he spat. "There is no enemy nearer than Corinth." Sherman mistrusted his subordinate, who turned out to be right, while Grant trusted his, who turned out to be wrong. To Grant, Sherman sent a dispatch that reported some saucy fighting along the picket lines, but concluded, "I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position." Sherman's dispatch went out by courier at about the same time that General Johnston had made up his mind to attack at dawn. The following dawn, April 6th, was a tranquil southern Sabbath, clear and mild, peach trees in bloom. It was shortly to become the Devil's Own Day. The Confederates had slept on their arms the night before, according to Beauregard's battle plan. At first light, Hardee's corps moved out, and soon after the entire rebel army was in motion toward the Federal camps to make good Johnston's resolve. Tonight we will water our horses in the Tennessee River. Hardee's first blows fell on the divisions of Sherman and Benjamin M. Prentiss, a Mexican War veteran, roughly in line in front of Shiloh Church and facing southwest. The Federals were not entrenched, as Beauregard had predicted, but neither were they entirely unprepared, despite what Northern papers would later write about sleeping Yankees routed from their dog tents. Well before dawn, Prentiss, anxious about the activity in his area, had sent out a patrol that collided with the Confederate advance. The skirmishing had given Prentiss time to get his brigades out of camp and into line, with Sherman forming on his right. As it happened, the first fierce rebel blows would fall on Grant's greenest divisions. Civil War soldiers described their first experience of combat as seeing the elephant. Many, in both blue and gray, decided quickly that their first look was more than enough and broke wildly to the rear. No one knows how many thousands of Yankees spent the day cowering under the bluffs of the river, nor how many rebels spent it looting the camps or hiding in the woods. When Hardee's first battle line struck, many Yankees did break, but with Prentiss and Sherman coolly riding their lines, those who remained poured a deadly fire into the rebel lines and beat back 4 assaults. A 5th finally drove them back to take up a second position in their rear, leaving before them, as one soldier remembered, a pavement of dead men. Sherman, who had taken 2 slight wounds himself, sent to Grant for reinforcements, reporting that "We are holding them pretty well just now, but it's hot as hell." It was in truth hot as hell, and it was only going to get hotter. Both Johnston and Grant were busy getting fresh troops into the fight. On the Confederate side, the second line, Bragg's, had come up and moved through Hardee's. Although the new corps added weight to the rebel assault, at the same time it sowed confusion, as elements of both commands were mixed. The arrival of Polk and Breckinridge, of course, did nothing to resolve the confusion at the front. By mid-morning, however, some order was restored. Bragg on the right, Polk in the center, and Hardee on the left, in a loose line of battle stretching 6 miles from the river on their right to Owl Creek on their left. In the rear, Breckinridge was prepared to exploit any success. But Grant, too, was getting his divisions forward. First, John McClernand's division came up to plug a gap between Sherman's left and Prentiss's right. Then, forming in their rear, came the divisions of W. H. Wallace, commanding in the place of C. F. Smith, now out of the battle with an infected leg. Grant sent also for his 6th Division under Lew Wallace, 5 miles away north of Snake Creek. Wallace would later win fame as a novelist, but never as a field commander. The future author of Ben-Hur took a wrong road, got lost, and never reached the field until the first day's fighting was over. Finally, Grant sent a dispatch to Savannah, just 9 miles downriver. The lead elements of Buell's army were there, and they were wanted urgently on the field. Whether Grant could hold his line, and the landing itself, until Buell arrived, however, was very much in doubt. And if he could not, he had a first-rate disaster on his hands. On his right, the battle was devouring Sherman and McClernand's divisions greedily, bending the Union line slowly but steadily back toward the landing. W. H. Wallace and Hurlbut had committed both their divisions in support of McClernand and Prentiss, but these too were being driven in the fiercest fighting the war had yet seen. And for both sides, it was about to get fiercer. Prentiss, in falling back, found a likely place to reform, an old wagon road slightly sunken. Grant came up and ordered Prentiss to maintain that position at all hazards. Yankees who survived the fight would remember it as the sunken road, rebels as the hornet's nest. From noon until near sundown, the Confederates made a dozen assaults on the position, front and flanks, pressing 18,000 men against 4,500 Yankees. If Johnston forced this point to buckle, he had every chance to water his horses in the Tennessee River very soon. Seeing his advance stalled in front of the sunken road, Johnston rode forward to press it once more. Just to the left of the road was a peach orchard, now held by elements of Hurlbut's division supported by artillery. Survivors remembered the dead of both sides showered gently with peach blossoms. Nearby was a little pond where the wounded crawled to drink. It would be remembered as Bloody Pond. "Men," Johnston shouted, "they are stubborn. We must use the bayonet." He led them forward into the musketry, and Hurlbut's men, after a stubborn fight, finally broke and ran. Minnie balls had torn Johnston's coat, and one had nearly ripped a boot sole off. It seemed a good joke. "They didn't trip me up that time," he laughed, and shook the flapping sole. Moments later he slumped in the saddle. He had been shot in the back of the thigh, just above the knee, and was bleeding to death. His surgeon, who might have saved his life with a simple tourniquet, was at the moment attending, at Johnston's direction, Federal wounded. With Johnston dead, command passed to Beauregard, who understood as clearly as Johnston had the urgent need to pry the Yankees loose from the sunken road. If they couldn't be driven out, they might be blasted out, he reasoned. About 3:30, he brought 62 guns forward, and at point-blank range pounded the position with grape shot and canister. For the Yankees, it was hell in a small space. Eventually, Hurlbut's survivors on the left and W. H. Wallace's on the right broke to the rear. Completely surrounded now, Prentiss stood, believing that at all hazards meant what it said. 2 hours of pounding later, even Prentiss was willing to submit to the inevitable and surrendered his command. Just 2,200 of the 4,500 who had gone into the fight that morning. In his rear, however, Grant had had time enough to shore up a line on a ridge in front of the landing and support it heavily with artillery. Still, Beauregard believed that one more hard blow would crack it. He ordered one more assault all along the line, and his exhausted army went sluggishly forward, ran into murderous musketry and cannon fire, and fell back. The sun was sinking in the sky, and the slaughter was done for this day. As darkness drew on and rain began to fall, it was time to take a reckoning. If the Federals had not been pushed into the river, they had been driven 2 full miles, and now stood with their backs to the landing itself. An entire division had been mauled and then compelled to surrender, and Yankee losses all along the line were staggering. On the Confederate side, the commanding general was dead, and his army was utterly fought out, bled white by its dead and wounded, astonishingly disorganized by the extent of its own advance, and diminished by straggling. There was no reckoning how many hungry, curious, or cowardly rebels were wandering the Federal camps, feasting on Yankee coffee, sugar, hardtack, and bacon, or worse yet, celebrating the day with captured whiskey. Nor was there then, as now, any wise measure of the magnitude of human suffering on that field. All that may be said with certainty is that 2,000 of both sides who saw the tranquil Sabbath dawn now lay dead and silent in the rain. 10,000 in blue and gray lay maimed. But these were not silent. In the dark downpour they called out to comrades, to distant mothers, to the God of battles. Despite the heavy cost of the day's fighting, neither side had any thought of yielding the field. Beauregard believed he had Grant just where he wanted him, and would finish him in the morning. He wired Richmond, "After a severe battle of 10 hours, thanks be to the Almighty, we gained a complete victory, driving the enemy from every position." It would be an interesting study to number all the inconclusive combats that generals advertised as complete victories. For there was one crucial position that the enemy had not been driven from, and that was Pittsburgh Landing, where even now Buell's lead division was arriving. For Grant, there seems to have been no thought of anything except counterattack. When a staff officer suggested withdrawal, Grant countered, "Retreat? No, I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." He had good reasons for confidence. For one, 20,000 of Buell's men would be ashore by dawn. For another, Lew Wallace's division, veterans of Donelson, had at dusk finally got across Snake Creek Bridge and fallen in on the Union right. Despite his losses, Grant could send 40,000 troops, more than half of them fresh, against Beauregard's 25,000. These had fought all day long and were now trying to sleep on the muddy field amid the thunder of the heavens and the gunboats on the river. But Beauregard, who had urged Johnston not to attack in the first place, now was determined to press the attack in the morning. He might have thought otherwise if he knew what Bedford Forrest knew, that Buell's army was not in northern Alabama, as a recent report had said, but was getting off transports at Pittsburgh Landing. Forrest was quite sure what that meant. "If the enemy comes on us in the morning, we'll be whipped like hell." At dawn on April 7th, Beauregard's plans were a moot point. From Sherman's own tent, where he had spent the night, Beauregard could hear the first shots of the artillery barrage that preceded the Federal assault all along the line. Rebels who had delivered a surprise attack yesterday received one today. In their weary and disorganized condition, they were at first driven easily, but by mid-morning Beauregard had restored order. With Hardee on the right, Breckinridge in the center, and Bragg on the left (Polk had mistakenly taken his corps to the rear in the night), the Confederates were making a stiff fight on the very ground they had fought over so fiercely the day before, the little ridge in front of Sherman's camp. Sherman himself called it the severest musketry he had ever heard. But by 2 o'clock or so it was becoming clear to the Confederate command that their exhausted troops were nearing the point of collapse, threatening not just defeat but total disaster. Not only were they physically used up, but psychologically worn out, seeing fresh Yankees snatching away the victory that yesterday had seemed theirs for the taking. Tennessee Governor Isham Harris serving as an aide to Beauregard that day, asked, "General, do you not think our troops are very much in the condition of a lump of sugar thoroughly soaked in water, preserving its original shape, though ready to dissolve?" The general indeed thought so, and began sending orders for a withdrawal. About 4 o'clock, with Breckinridge in line south of Shiloh Church, and supported by artillery to cover the retreat, Hardee, Polk, and Bragg fell back. The green troops who had come up from Corinth in such confusion retreated in good order. The Federals reoccupied their camps around the log church known as Shiloh, place of peace. Beauregard's rear guard had little to guard against, for there was no pursuit. The Yankees, too, were bloodied and bone-weary, and more rain and loss of traffic had taken the bottoms out of the roads again. That night sleet and hail added to everyone's misery. The next morning the rebels were back on the road to Corinth. Sherman took a brigade down the Corinth road, not so much pursuing as shooing the rebels along. 4 miles out, at a place called Fallen Timbers, the Yankees ran into cavalry led by a man who didn't care to be shooed, that devil Forrest. When Sherman shook out a line of skirmishers and sent them forward, Forrest led a charge into their midst. By the time he reached their line, however, he was alone, and whirling his horse, he tried to slash his way out with his saber. In the melee, he caught a musket ball in the back, but keeping his seat, he snatched up a Yankee, threw him across his horse's backside as a shield, and galloped off to safety. Only then did he fling the hapless Yankee aside. The Battle of Shiloh was over. There was grim work left to be done on the field, though, as the wounded were gathered up and the dead buried in shallow graves. And there was some grim accounting to be done by Americans north and south. Of the nearly 100,000 men who struggled there, more than 23,000 were casualties. Shiloh had been the bloodiest battle ever fought on the continent. The casualties of 2 days' fighting exceeded those of the Revolution, the War of 1812, and Mexico combined. A full year of war had not brought either cause the swift, decisive victory it imagined in the days after Sumter. This battle had, however, led U.S. Grant to a hard conclusion. Though he had gone into the battle believing the rebels demoralized and ready to quit, after Shiloh he was convinced that the only way to save the Union was by complete conquest. In fact, Grant had done his cause signal service at Shiloh. Although surprised and in a desperate predicament, he had acted coolly and capably. As a result, he had delivered a crippling blow to the main Confederate army in the West. The Federal grip there was firmer than ever, and the initiative was entirely in their hands. In Northern newspapers, however, Grant, so lately lionized as the hero of Henry and Donelson, was now cast as an incompetent. Old charges of drunkenness were renewed. But if Grant had at the moment few friends in the papers, he had one in the White House. When a Pennsylvania politician came to Lincoln to demand Grant's removal, Lincoln turned him away curtly. "I can't spare this man," he said. "He fights."
We are springing to the call of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll fill the vacant ranks with 1,000,000 freemen more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah!